Welcome to Gemara Academy. In this class, we will learn Tosfos Dibra Maschil Ba'aseisa. Let's begin by looking at the flowchart to see what part of the Gemara Tosfos is coming to explain. At this point in the Gemara, we had a question. Why is it when between the Ani and the Baal Habayis, the Malacha was done, aren't they chayev? Vasavida Malacha Mibinai. Between the two of them, Malacha was performed. The Gemara answered by presenting a teaching from a Brisa. The Brisa says we learn out from the word Ba'aseisa. That's written in the pasuk that speaks about the Chiyuv Chatas. Ha'oises kula v'loya ois miktsasa. One who does the whole malacha is chayav the korban chatas, not one who does part of it. Yachid va'asa oisa. If one person did the malacha, chayav. Shnaim shasu. If two people did the malacha, p'turim their pater. So let's begin with the general outline of Tosfos. In the Gemara, we presented the brisa that learned that from the word ba'aseisa. Ha'oises kula v'loya ois miktsasa. One who does the whole thing brings the korban chatas, not one who does part of it. Yachid va'asa oisa chayav. If one person did the malacha, is chayav. Shnaim shasu, if two people did the malacha, p'turim their pater. So there's three parts of Tosfos. Number one is Tosfos will explain how we learn this out from Ba'aseisa. How do we learn out from the word Ba'aseisa that only if a person does the whole malacha is they chayav a korban chatas, and not if he does part of it. Number two is Tosfos will prove that although it sounds like there's two dinim here in the brisa, two teachings, it can only be one. Why does it sound like two? Because first it says ha'isas kula v'loya is miktsasa, that sounds like one teaching, and then it says Yachid v'asa chayiv. If one person did it, is chayiv. Yachid v'asa is a chayiv. If one person did it, is chayiv. Beishasu p'turim. If two people did it, they're pater. It sounds like there are two teachings here. Tosfos will tell us which two teachings they sound like, but nevertheless it cannot be that it's two. The third and final part of Tosfos is he will present two questions. The first one he won't answer, and the second one he will. Let's go through Tosfos now in the flowchart. We presented a brisa that said, from the word Ba'aseisa we learn out ha'isa is kula, one who does the whole malacha is chayiv a korban chatas. V'loya oisa miktsasa, not one who does part of it. Yachid va'asa oisa chayiv. If one person did it, is chayiv. Beishasu, if two people did it, p'turim their pater. Says Tosfos, this is the girsa in all Sfarim. And now Tosfos will explain two things about this girsa. Number one, how the limit is learnt out, and number two, that although it sounds like two teachings, and which two teachings they sound like, nevertheless it can only be one. So first let's start with how we learn this out. So the simple meaning of the pasuk is that Ba'aseisa goes on the word nefesh. The pasuk says, "V'im nefesh achas techta b'shgaga ma'ama uretz." If a nefesh, if a person does an aver by mistake from among the people, Ba'aseisa, by doing achas mitzvahs Hashem asher lo ta'asana, one of the commands of Hashem that He said not to do, va'ashem, and he was guilty. So the simple way of reading the pasuk is that Ba'aseisa is referring to the nefesh. If v'im nefesh, if a person does an aver Ba'aseisa, when this nefesh does the following. However, in our Gemara, we darshan Ba'aseisa to go on the words that come after it. Ba'aseisa, by doing achas me mitzvahs Hashem, one of the things that Hashem said asher lo ta'asana, not to do, he needs to do that entire thing. V'lo oisa miktsasa. Then Tosfos continues and says that this entire brisa is one teaching and it's just repeating itself. When it says ha'isas kula v'lo oisa miktsasa, and then it says yachid v'asa oisa chayiv shnaim shasu p'turim, it's one of the same teaching just being repeated. And Tosfos says we can say that there's two teachings here. What would be the two teachings? Teaching number one is ha'isas kula v'lo oisa miktsasa, that only if a person does the entire malacha is chayiv, but not if he only did part of it. For example, by Heitzah, if he only did the akir, only did the hanacha. And the second teaching is Yachid v'asa is chayiv shnaim shasu p'turim, is saying that only if a person did the entire malacha on his own is he chayiv, but if he did it jointly with his fellow, not that each person did part of it, but rather they both did the entire malacha together. So they both did the akira together, and they took it out of the rishus and put it down together, they're going to be pater. Says Tosfos, we cannot say that the brisa is saying two teachings, although that's what it sounds like in the words, and it sounds like it from the fact that it's two things are taught over here. How do we know that it's not two teachings? From two proofs Tosfos presents. Number one, in order to teach two things, or these two things, we need two psukim. The Gemara later on in Parakam Etzniya says that it's true that both of these cases are pater, when a person does part of the malacha and when he does it jointly with his fellow. But the Gemara says over there that we need two psukim for it. And here in our brisa, we're only presenting one pasuk, the pasuk of Ba'aseisa. So it can be that we're learning two teachings from it. And the second proof is that after we present this brisa, the Gemara says Itmar Nami, we also learned this teaching elsewhere. And in that Itmar Nami, in that second proof, where we said this teaching elsewhere, the only words in that teaching is Yachid v'asa es chayiv shnaim shasu p'turim. If one person did it, is chayiv. If two people did it, they're pater. So clearly, those words are not the teaching of that. If a person does it jointly with his fellow, he's pater. It must be the teaching that if he did part of the malacha, he's pater. Because otherwise, it wouldn't be appropriate to bring it in our Gemara, where we're talking about where each person did part of the malacha. And with that, we're done with the first part of Tosfos, where we see how the teaching works from Ba'aseisa. And number two, we see that the brisa, although it sounds like it's two teachings, it's only one. Now we'll move on to the next part of Tosfos, where he asks two questions. The first one he doesn't answer, and the second one he does. So the first question of Tosfos is, that in Perkam Tzniya, the Gemara says that this teaching that a person is not chayiv if he does part of the malacha is learned from the same pasuk, but it's learned out either from the word nefesh or from achas. There's two different possible ways of learning it. And over here we're saying that we learn it not from Baal Seisa. Tosfos leaves that question. And now we have another question that re-asked, and it's based on the Yerushalmi. It starts off with an introduction. Tosfos says, from this that we need a pasuk, Baal Seisa, that if a person does part of the malacha is pater, it indicates that this way of doing the malacha was found in the Mishkan, that each person did part of it. Because if it wasn't done in the Mishkan, we wouldn't need a pasuk to tell us it's pater. We know it's pater on our own. As we learned earlier on, that by Hatzah specifically, unlike all other malachas, not only does the Av need to be in the Mishkan in order to be chayiv, but so does the Tulda need to be in the Mishkan in order to be chayiv. So if this wasn't done in the Mishkan, we wouldn't need a pasuk to tell us it's pater. We know that it's pater because it wasn't in the Mishkan. So what do we see over here? That even if something's done in the Mishkan, if we have a pasuk to tell us that it's pater, we'll say that it's pater. And Tosfos then brings another place where we see this as well. The case where two people doing the malacha jointly, we know that it's pater from a teaching in a pasuk, which is learned in a different part of the Gemara, and that was also done in the Mishkan. When the Leviim were carrying the Aron, nobody was able to carry it alone. They each needed the other in order to carry it. And even though it was found in the Mishkan, since we have a pasuk teaching us that it's pater, the halacha is that it's pater. And this leads us to a question on the Yerushalmi, because there's a Shalmi that says that Moshe is only chayev when there's two people involved. Moshe is when a person passes from one Rosh Hashanah to another Rosh Hashanah over Rosh Hashanah on one side of the street. So it's from one porch to another porch on the same side of the street. If it was a different side, it would be pater. So the Yerushalmi says that the case of Moshe, when a person's chayev, when he passes from one porch to another on the same side of the street, is only if there's two people involved. There's one person on one porch and another person on the other porch. And the Yerushalmi asks, but usually we know that when two people do a malacha, they're pater. So how come here they're chayiv? And the Yerushalmi answers, because that's the way it was done in the Mishkan. And now the question is, ma bekach, what of it? So what if it was done in the Mishkan? We just showed that even if something's done in the Mishkan, nevertheless, if there's a pasuk telling us that it's pater, it's going to be pater. So why does the Yerushalmi say that even though there's a pasuk that says it's pater, it's going to be chayiv because it was done in the Mishkan? And Tosfos answers that the Yerushalmi's case is not referring to a case where each person did part of the malacha. It sounds as if the person on one porch did akira and the person on the other porch did anacha. That's not the case. Rather, the case was that one person did entire malacha. He picked it up, he passed it over, and he did the anacha. The Yerushalmi is just telling us that we would think that if a person did this, he's chayiv, regardless of whether there's a person on the other porch or not. Says the Yerushalmi, since in the Mishkan there was another person on the other Rosh Hashanah, therefore only if a person does it and places it into the other person's hand in the other porch is he going to be chayiv. However, if the other porch was empty and he lifted it up and passed it over, he's going to be pater. However, this brings up a question which Tosfos will address, and that is, if that's the case, that the situation in the Yerushalmi is that the person did the entire malacha, so why does the Yerushalmi ask, and we'll point it out right over here, but usually by two people it's pater? Why does the Yerushalmi ask that usually by two people it's pater? This wasn't a case of two people, this is a case of one person. So Tosfos explains, the Yerushalmi was only pointing out the following. It was one person, but the Yerushalmi was pointing out that generally speaking, when you have one person doing a malacha, he's chayiv. The moment another person's involved, it creates a patur. And over here, it's sort of the opposite. If the person did it entirely on his own, he'll be patur. But if there's another person there, true that other person didn't do any part of the malacha, but he needs to be there, suddenly it becomes chayiv. So the Yerushalmi is just pointing out that that's something which sort of doesn't fit with the usual way of the way we rule, the way we paskin. The Yerushalmi answers, because that's the way it was done in the Mishkan. So to summarize, the first part of Tosfos we explained how we learn out from Baseisa, the halacha of Ha'isas Kulav, that if a person does part of a malacha, he's going to be pater. And we also, the first part of Tosfos also explained that even though it sounds like there's two teachings in the Brisa, it could only be one. And the second part of Tosfos we asked two questions. One question was that in our Gemara we said that this teaching of Ha'isas Kulav is learned from Baseisa. And in Parakam Tzniya we said we learn it out from either Nefesh or Achas. And the second question was that it seems from the Yerushalmi that if something was done in the Mishkan, even if it's done through two people, and we have a pasuk telling us that that's pater, it'll still be chayiv since it was done in the Mishkan. And we explained that the Yerushalmi's case is not referring to a case where the two people did it together, that each person did part of the malacha, but rather it's a case where one person did the entire malacha. And the only condition necessary is that he did the entire malacha, but there was another person there, and the hanacha was done into the other person's hand.